Welcome to Classic Detective Status, where each tale unfolds like a cozy chat over a steaming cup of coffee. Today, I present a delightful new mystery starring the ever-observant and brilliantly astute Miss Marple, the beloved amateur sleuth crafted by Agatha Christie. Settle in, and together, let's unravel this charming puzzle. If you feel inclined, drop a quick comment to share your location. It's always a joy to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's dive into the mystery of Miss Marple and the murder that awaits. Never Happened Chapter 1. The arrival at Foxglove Manor. Miss Mel had long held the conviction that the Morning Post could no longer deliver surprises, especially at her age. Yet, as she carefully unfolded the delicate, perfumed stationery, a familiar name leapt from the page: Lady Elena Harway. It had been years since their last encounter, a fleeting acquaintance in a London tea room. Now, the lady's trembling hand had penned an urgent plea. "My dear Miss Merrill, I write to you in great distress. A most terrible thing has happened, one which no one will. I am convinced that my nephew Gerald has been murdered, yet there is no body, no proof. The police dismiss my concerns, and whispers circulate among the household behind my back. I fear the truth is being buried. Please, if you can, come to Foxglove Manor at once." Miss Merrill read the letter twice. A murder, yet no body, no proof. A curious predicament indeed. She had encountered many desperate appeals over the years, yet something about this one, the urgency, the isolation, pricked at her mind. Gerald Harway, the name was faintly familiar, a young man of some means, if memory served. Though prone to certain indiscretions, the village of Foxglove, nestled deep in the countryside, was not a place one simply passed through. It was a place where old families held onto their secrets tightly, where loyalty and silence walked hand in hand. Miss Marple, with a practiced sigh, set down her teacup. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the clock ticked steadily on the mantelpiece. Well, if no one else believed Lady Elena, perhaps it was time someone did. The air was thick with damp as Miss Marple stepped from the hired car. The imposing figure of Foxglove Manor rose before her, a testament to both age and dignity, yet tinged with an air of melancholy even in the bright light of day. The ivy-clad stonework seemed a murmur of unresolved troubles, and at the entrance, a stiff butler accepted her case with scarcely a word. Inside, the scent of aged wood and faded roses lingered in the air, while shadows stretched long across the tiled hallway. Lady Eleanor appeared almost immediately, her frame more delicate than Miss Mel remembered, her pale fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. "Oh, my dear Miss Merrill," she breathed, clasping her hand. "I feared you might not come." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "My dear Lady Eleanor, I should think an invitation such as yours could not be ignored." She was ushered into a dimly lit sitting room where heavy drapes smothered the late afternoon light. It was a house of whispers, of footsteps that did not wish to be heard. A shiver of unease prickled at Miss Marple's senses. There was something in the air, something beyond grief. "Fear," Lady Eleanor's voice trembled. "They say, I imagine it, that he has run away, but I know my Gerald, he could not vanish." Without a word, Miss Merrill patted her hand reassuringly, but her mind was already at work. In houses such as these, secrets were never truly buried. They merely waited for the right eyes to find them. Lady Elena's hands trembled as she gripped the arm of her chair. Her eyes, once sharp and commanding, now flitted about the dimly lit room, searching for something unseen. "They think I'm imagining it," she whispered, "that I've become confused, that grief has unhinged me, but I know what Gerald is dead." Miss Marple, seated opposite, regarded her carefully. The old lady was indeed distressed, but not unhinged. There was an urgency in her voice, an absolute conviction. "But there is nobody," Miss Marple said gently, probing. Lady Eleanor stiffened. "No, nobody. No police inquiry, no concern from anyone. The household continues as if nothing has happened. But I know." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a hush. "Someone has taken him from me." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together softly. "And yet, my dear Lady Eleanor, without evidence, without even a hint of scandal in the village, how can you be so certain?" The old woman pressed a hand to her chest. "Gerald would not leave me. He would not vanish without a word. And because of the letter." Miss Marple's fingers paused mid-stitch. "A letter?" Lady Elena nodded. "A letter in his own hand, postmarked after his supposed death. I saw it, held it, and now it's gone." A flicker of interest passed through Miss Marple's eyes. Now that was something. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Tell me about this letter, Lady Eleanor. You mentioned having seen it when, where, and under what circumstances?" Lady Elena's fingers twisted in her lap as she recalled it. It arrived 3 days after Gerald's disappearance, a single page hastily written. It wasn't characteristic of him. His writing was always so neat, so careful. But this was rushed, almost frantic. Its contents were simple. He was safe, and I must not worry. Yet, I knew she swallowed hard. I knew immediately that something was off. The phrasing, the tone. Gerald would never have written to me so impersonally. And then, when I went to show it to Reginald, it had vanished. Reginald, my late husband's brother, now holds the reins of the estate. He has been quite adamant that I cease discussing Gerald's disappearance, urging me to let it rest. Miss Marple's fingers danced lightly against the arm of her chair. But was Reginald the sole individual with access to the letter? Lady Eleanor shook her head. The entire household could have taken it, the maid, the butler, even Iris, Gerald's fiancée. Yet, when I brought it up, they all regarded me as if I had lost my senses. Miss Marple leaned back, her gaze thoughtful. A letter pinned after a man's supposed death, a household reluctant to accept his absence, and a woman unwavering in her belief of murder despite the absence of any visible crime. Things were certainly not as they appeared. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Victim. Miss Marple had encountered many dismissive policemen throughout her experiences. In small villages, constables often prioritized maintaining peace over stirring up trouble. Thus, as she sat across from Constable Finch, she found his demeanor unsurprising. Lady Eleanor insists her nephew has been murdered. She said gently. Finch sighed, rubbing his jaw. Miss Marple, we've no reason to believe any crime has been committed. No proof. She asked mildly. Exactly? He leaned forward. Look, Gerald Harrow's got a reputation, always flitting off when things get difficult. I wouldn't put it past him to disappear for a few weeks and return when he needs more money. Miss Mel's hands rested lightly in her lap. Lady Eleanor is quite convinced this is different. Finch exhaled sharply because she refuses to see the truth. Truthfully, if there were any genuine indications of foul play, wouldn't we be compelled to investigate? Yet here we stand with nothing, no witnesses, no crime scene, not even a report of a missing person. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with intrigue. Surely, a young man who has vanished qualifies as a missing person. Finch paused, asserting that he was an unreliable young man, and that distinction mattered. Miss Marple nodded, seemingly in agreement, but her mind was already sifting through his words. The police had dismissed the case altogether, perhaps too hastily. Outside, the village square thrived with its usual bustle. People gossiped, exchanged pleasantries, and went about their business. No one seemed concerned that Gerald was missing. If he truly had run off, then why did Foxglove Manor feel so uneasy? The manor held a silence that was almost suffocating, not the peaceful quiet of a home at ease, but something else, something unnatural. Miss Marple had always believed that a household, much like a person, carried a pulse, and here that pulse was weak, hesitant, full of unspoken tension. Sir Reginald Har stood near the fireplace, arms folded, his expression with a mask of impatience. I do wish Lady Elena would let this matter rest. It's most tiresome. Miss Marple smiled politely, yet you must admit it is rather unusual for one's nephew to simply disappear without a word. Sir Reginald's mouth tightened. Gerald has always been an irresponsible young man. This isn't the first time he's vanished, and I dare say it won't be the last. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Then you are quite certain he is alive? He hesitated. It was fleeting, but she caught at a moment of doubt, a crack in his composure. His certainty was palpable. Across the room, Iris Whitmore, Gerald's fiancée, sat rigidly in an armchair, her knuckles white as they gripped the fabric. Her eyes darted to Miss Marple and then away again. She was afraid, but of what? Nearby, Harriet Finch, the maid, hovered near the doorway, her posture stiff and her eyes cast downward. Miss Marple had spent years observing people and understood the distinction between difference and fear. She turned back to Sir Reginald, her voice light, noting that Gerald had left nothing behind. Letters provided no hint of his intentions. Reginald sighed, feeling the weight of uncertainty. Yet, Miss Marple observed a subtle shift, a flicker of movement from Harriet, a slight downturn of her mouth, the tightening of her hands in her apron. It was clear that someone in this house was withholding the truth. Miss Marple had long recognized that the most telling revelations often emerged from those who were typically ignored. Thus, when Harriet Finch, the maid, hesitated in the dimly lit corridor, glancing nervously over her shoulder, Miss Marple sensed she was on the brink of uncovering something significant. "It is crucial that I express my thoughts," Harriet murmured, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. Sir Reginald claims it's nonsense. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Sometimes, nonsense is merely a truth that people are reluctant to accept. Harriet's fingers clenched tighter. It was the night before Master Gerald vanished. I heard something. Miss Marple remained quiet, allowing the heaviness of unspoken words to linger. There was an argument, Harriet finally whispered, in the study. Master Gerald and someone else a woman. Miss Marple's gaze became more intense. Are you certain it was a woman, Harriet? She nodded quickly, her voice low, yet I could sense the anger beneath it. She mentioned something about what was owed, a curious choice of words, not what was taken, but what was owed. Before Miss Marple could inquire further, footsteps echoed down the hall. Harriet paled, stepping back, her lips pressing together. Lady Eleanor emerged from the shadows, her voice taut. Miss Marple, I was hoping to speak with you. Miss Marple glanced at Harriet once more, but the girl had already lowered her head, slipping away before another word could be exchanged. Be coaxed from her, someone in foxglove manner did not want Harriet talking, and that in itself was very revealing indeed. Later that evening, as Lady Eleanor dozed by the fire, Miss Marple found herself perusing a stack of old correspondence on the writing desk, a habit, she told herself, some people idly stitched when thinking. She had always preferred letters, and then something odd caught her attention. A bank statement carelessly tucked between unopened letters. Miss Marple's brow furrowed as her eyes traced the dates. The last withdrawal from Gerald's account was made 2 days ago, 2 days after his supposed murder. The ink was fresh, the signature crisp. Gerald Harway. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, fingers tapping lightly against the paper. The implications were fascinating. If Gerald was truly dead, who had signed his name? She turned the document over, searching for further clues, but before she could study it further, Lady Eleanor stirred, blinking blearily. Is everything all right, dear? Miss Mell smiled, slipping the paper back into its place. Oh, quite all right, Lady Elena. I was simply thinking about how very deceptive appearances can be, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, was Gerald truly dead, or was this a murder that had never happened at all? Chapter 3. Whispers and Warnings. Lady Elena sat stiffly in her chair, fingers twisting the edge of her lace handkerchief. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of exhaustion. They call me foolish, she murmured. Hysterical, but I know my Gerald is dead. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Forgive me, Lady Eleanor, but how can you be so certain? A flicker of frustration passed over the older woman's face, because he would never have left me, not without a word, not like this. Miss Mar's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. You have no proof, though, no body, no sign of struggle. Lady Elena's grip tightened. Does one always need proof to know what is true? A mother knows when her child is in pain. A woman knows when her loved one is lost to her. A reasonable sentiment, certainly, but conviction was not evidence, and evidence was what Miss Marple required. And yet Miss Marple said lightly, there are many who believe Gerald to be. Lady Elena's mouth thinned, and she declared, they are very much alive. Miss Marple let the silence settle between them. It was a curious thing, this certainty of Lady Elena's. It was not grief that fueled it, nor mere suspicion. No, it was fear. The village of Foxglove was a place where people spoke in hushed tones and listened with sharpened ears. At the bakery, Miss Marple heard whispers of debts unpaid. At the grocer's, murmurs of a woman unknown to the Herway name. And at the post office, a knowing look passed between two elderly ladies as they spoke. Of Gerald Harry, as if he had earned whatever fate had befallen him. It was all quite captivating. Mrs. Pettigrew, the seamstress, leaned in with a conspiratorial air. You didn't hear it from me, Miss Marple, but there's talk that Gerald was associating with a lady of dubious reputation. Miss Marple's expression remained politely neutral. How intriguing. And that's not the worst of it, Mrs. Pettigrew continued, lowering her voice. Some say he owed money, large sums. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with curiosity. To whom, I wonder? Mrs. Pettigrew hesitated. Well, that part's somewhat ambiguous, yet there have been several gentlemen in sharp London suits hovering around in recent months, posing questions that are even more captivating, a clandestine romance, monetary issues, and outsiders probing into matters that the village appeared to know far too well about. Gerald Harrow's existence, perhaps excessively so. Miss Marple had always held the conviction that minor details were the most revealing. The fold in a letter, a half-finished cup of tea, or in this instance, a watch that was out of sync. It was a sophisticated timepiece, its golden casing tarnished by time, resting upon the bedside table in Gerald Haraway's empty room. It initially appeared unremarkable, a personal item left behind in haste. However, as Miss Marr's fingers brushed against its cool surface, her keen eyes narrowed. The watch had stopped at 10:47, the glass cracked as if from a fall. A simple accident, perhaps, yet something about it felt off. Lady Eleanor had claimed Gerald disappeared before midnight, yet a watch wound properly would not have stopped so early. More curiously, why had no one mentioned it? Miss Marple turned it over, her thumb tracing its edges. Tracing the engraving on the back, a gift most likely, but there was no dust beneath it, no indication that it had been resting there long. Someone had moved it recently. She slipped it into her pocket, her mind already working. A watch set to the wrong time was rarely a mistake. It was a message, an inconsistency, a clue left behind, either by accident or design. It was Harriet Finch, the maid, who spoke of at first a figure seen moving in the garden after dark. Miss Marple had found her in the corridor, hands trembling as she adjusted a vase. Flowers danced in the light as her eyes flickered toward the windows. "I saw something last night," Miss Harriet whispered, just past the rose trellis. "A man, or at least I think it was a man." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You think?" Harriet swallowed. It was only a shadow, but it didn't move like a servant. It waited, as if it were watching. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the watch in her pocket. And did anyone else see this figure? Harriet hesitated. "No, one believes me. They say it was a trick of the moonlight." Miss Marple nodded slowly. It seemed almost too convenient. If Gerald was indeed dead, then who was it that lingered near the manor in the dead of night? And if Gerald was alive, why had he not come inside? Or worse, was someone making sure he remained missing? Chapter 4. The Woman in the Photograph. Miss Marple held the belief that a person's true essence was often hidden not in their spoken words, but in the small, overlooked remnants they left behind. Thus, as she sat in Gerald Haraway's study, her fingers gently gliding over the stacks of papers and unopened letters, she focused on what had been left behind. Concealed within the depths of an intricately designed writing desk, nestled beneath a mound of unused stationery, lay a photograph. Its edges had faded, yet the image remained distinct enough to reveal Gerald Haraway's recognizable face alongside a woman unknown to Miss Marple. She examined the picture closely. Gerald appeared impeccably dressed, exuding a casual elegance, while the woman beside him exhibited an odd demeanor, neither affectionate nor completely at ease. There was a rigidity to her, a sense of caution. Miss Marple flipped the photograph over, revealing a handwritten note on the back. Ink that had long since begun to fade, two new beginnings of vague inscription, but meaningful in its way, a message, a marker of some significant moment in time. Miss Marr's lips pursed in thought. Who was this woman? More importantly, why had the photograph been hidden? People did not conceal things unless they had something to fear, and fear, as Miss Marple well knew, had a way of unraveling even the most carefully kept secrets. The household's reaction to the photograph was as telling as the photograph itself. Sir Reginald barely. He glanced at it, having never seen her before, and said far too dismissively. Iris Whitmore, Gerald's fiancée, stared at the image a fraction too long before shaking her head. I don't know who she is." Harriet, the maid, went pale. I couldn't say, miss," she stammered, her eyes darting towards the door. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Harriet a moment longer. The girl knew something, but fear held her tongue. And then there was Lady Elena. The moment the photograph touched her hands, her face changed. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. As Miss Marple emerged, she waited in silence, for often silence spoke volumes more than words. At last, Lady Elena exhaled, pressing the photograph to her chest. "No, I do not know this woman," she said, her tone too careful a lie, though not an outright bold-faced one. It was a choice to withhold rather than deny. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against her lap, the photograph representing a hidden past, a woman no one dared to acknowledge. The truth, it seemed, was less about memory and more about willful forgetting. Harriet Finch bore the look of a woman who knew too much and regretted it deeply. Every bit of it. Her hands fluttered over with the tea tray as she set it down, her movements careful, too careful. Miss Marple watched her, knitting needles clicking softly. "Harriet, dear, I do believe there's something on your mind." Harriet swallowed hard. "I shouldn't talk about it, Mississippi. It's not my place." "Ah," Miss Marple said, looping another stitch. "But I find in my experience that the people who claim it's not their place to speak often have the most important things to say." Harriet hesitated, then with a glance towards As she lowered her voice, the door creaked slightly. It was a few weeks before Master Gerald vanished when a woman arrived at the manor. She was neither a lady nor a servant, but something in between. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with intrigue. "And how did she seem?" she asked. "Angry," Harriet replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "and determined. She was there for quite some time, speaking with him in the study. I overheard part of their conversation." Miss Marple's hand stilled, urging her to continue. Harriet's voice trembled as she recounted. "She said he had to do what was right, that he couldn't hide from it any longer. And he was frightened. I could hear it in his voice." Miss Marple nodded, as if unsurprised. "What happened after?" Harriet's fingers twisted in her apron. "She left, and Master Gerald, he wasn't the same after that. He seemed nervous, always looking over his shoulder. Then, days later, he vanished." Miss Marple finished for her, and Harriet finally nodded. Miss Marple sat quietly for a long moment, fingers resting lightly against her knitting. A mysterious woman, a fearful man, and a disappearance that no one wanted to investigate. It had all the makings of a crime of passion, a jealous heart. It was a scandalous affair, yet something felt amiss. Miss Marple pondered Gerald's habits and reputation. He had been reckless with money and perhaps with affections, but he wasn't foolish enough to provoke someone truly dangerous unless he had no other option. She turned back to Harriet, her tone gentle. "Tell me, dear, did this woman ever return?" Harriet shook her head quickly. "No, miss, at least not that I saw." Miss Marple's fingers tapped against the armrest. "A woman like that didn't simply vanish. No, she had come to the manor for a reason, and she had left. Was it due to her own accomplishments, or had she been thwarted? And what of Gerald? Had he disappeared of his own accord, or had someone orchestrated his vanishing?" The village buzzed with rumors of affairs and debts, men in fine suits posing questions. Yet these were mere distractions, whispers crafted to mislead. This was no ordinary scandal. It was something far more perilous. Chapter 5. The Truth Beneath the Surface. Miss Marple had always held the belief that the past had a way of catching up with individuals, particularly in families like the Hars, where land and legacy held paramount importance. Then love over tea with the village solicitor, Mr. Henry Phelps. She listened intently as he adjusted his spectacles and flipped through a yellowed stack of legal documents. "It's a rather delicate matter, Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice. "The Harway estate is not as secure as it appears." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "Go on." Mr. Phelps sighed. "There's been a long-standing dispute over a portion of land, a matter that Gerald Harway was rather preoccupied with before he disappeared." Miss Marple's fingers twitched over her knitting, preoccupied. How well he had been making inquiries, private ones. "I advised him to tread carefully. Inheritance disputes have a way of turning nasty. But I suspect he found something or someone he shouldn't have." Miss Mell leaned forward. "And who in particular would have had reason to silence him?" Mr. Phelps hesitated. "I can't say for certain, but Sir Reginald stands to lose a great deal if old claims are brought back into question." And there were whispers that Gerald wasn't acting alone. Someone was helping him dig into the past. Miss Marple's lips pursed, a hidden tension in the air. Land dispute, a nephew making dangerous inquiries, and now a disappearance that no one wanted to investigate. This was no longer just a family matter. It was a motive for murder. Miss Marple had always believed that the smallest inconsistencies often led to the greatest revelations. As she sat opposite Sir Reginald Harway, watching him pour himself a brandy, she chose her words carefully. "You were the last person to see Gerald before he vanished," she said mildly. Sir Reginald barely looked up. "Yes, at dinner we spoke briefly. He mentioned a business trip, and then he departed. That was the last I saw of him." Miss Marple tilted her head. "A business trip?" He nodded, mentioning something about meeting a man in London, though he seemed preoccupied. The knitting needles in Miss Marple's hands clicked rhythmically. Yet, according to the innkeeper at the Fox and Hound, Gerald never boarded the morning train. A flicker, so small that most would have missed it, crossed Sir Reginald's face, a hesitation in his hand as he raised his glass. Miss Marple's voice remained pleasant. Curious, wouldn't you say? Reginald took a slow sip before responding. Replying perhaps he changed his mind, Miss Merle smiled, or perhaps he never intended to leave it all. The silence between them stretched thick with unspoken truths. Miss Merle had seen many men lie in her time. Some did so out of fear, others out of guilt. But Sir Reginald, he was lying because he knew exactly what happened to Gerald Harway. Miss Merle had always believed that coincidences were rarely innocent, and so when she overheard a hushed conversation at the village post office about a woman seen at the bank on the very day of Gerald's final withdrawal, her curiosity was instantly ignited. It was Mrs. Harrington, the postmistress, who ultimately provided the crucial detail. "Oh yes, Miss Marple, I recall it vividly," Mrs. Harrington said, her voice lowered with the thrill of divulging a secret. The entire village was abuzz with the news. Gerald Harry had withdrawn a rather significant amount of money. "You see enough to catch anyone's attention." Miss Marple nodded, inquiring further. "And this woman you mentioned, she was present at the same time?" Mrs. Harrington's expression shifted, revealing more than words could convey. "Reflective, yet not overly so, dear." With her knitting halted mid-stitch, Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Harrington, dark-haired and elegant, was not the type one would typically associate with Gerald. She exuded an aura of someone well acquainted with trouble. Miss Marple smiled, and no one had considered this prior. Mrs. Harrington sniffed, noting that the police had never inquired, and Sir Reginald had rather insisted that Gerald's disappearance was not a matter for concern. Miss Marple expressed her gratitude and took her leave. Her thoughts whirled around a concealed land dispute, a mysterious woman, a significant amount of money withdrawn, and then an unsettling silence. This was no crime of chance. It was a calculated scheme, and someone had made certain that Gerald would never speak of it. Miss Merle had just arrived back at Foxglove Manor when the screams reverberated through the halls. Lady Elena lay crumpled at the base of the grand staircase, her delicate form twisted in an unnatural way. Harriet, the maid, knelt beside her, weeping. She was at the railing, Miss Harriet gasped, and then suddenly, Miss Merle lowered herself beside Lady Ellerin, noting the deep gash along her temple and the shallow, pained breath she took. A terrible accident, the others would say, but Miss Merle knew better. She turned to Sir Reginald, who stood stiffly at the landing above, his expression carefully composed, yet his fingers twitched in unconscious movement, a telltale sign of unease. "She was rather distressed earlier," he said smoothly. "Perhaps she lost her footing." Miss Merle studied him, a woman who had spent a lifetime navigating this house. Harriet did not merely lose her footing. She spoke again, her voice still trembling, as if addressing someone. "Miss, I heard voices, but by the time I turned, she was falling." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line as she conversed with someone. Lady Eleanor had spent weeks asserting that Gerald had been murdered, that there was something hidden from everyone else. And now, just as the truth began to emerge, someone had attempted to silence her forever. Miss Marple looked up toward the darkened landing, her keen gaze searching for what was amiss. Nothing. This had not been an accident. This had been a warning. Chapter 6. The Murder That Never Happened. The air inside Foxglove Manor was thick with unease. The grand drawing room, usually a place of quiet dignity, now held an audience of tense, expectant faces. Miss Merle sat with her hands neatly folded in her lap, surveying the assembled household. Lady Elena, pale but composed, clutched a lace handkerchief between her trembling fingers. Sir Reginald stood stiffly by the fireplace, his jaw set, his expression unreadable. Iris Whitmore, Gerald's fiancée, appeared on the verge of collapse, while Harriet Finch, the maid, pressed herself against the wall, her eyes flitting nervously as if anticipating the worst. Miss Merle cleared her throat softly. "I believe, my dears, that we have lingered in confusion long enough. It is time to bring clarity to this situation." Sir Reginald scoffed. "And what, pray tell, do you think you can reveal that we do not already know?" Miss Merle replied with a pleasant smile, "Quite a great deal, I should think." A hush fell over the room. Gerald Harry did not meet a tragic end, nor was he the victim of a gruesome murder. "Crime," she said. "No, my dear friends, Gerald's disappearance was no accident but an intricate deception. A sharp intake of breath from Iris, a flicker of something unreadable in her surreal eyes. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and continued, a deception that required not just planning but an accomplice. A murmur spread through the room like ripples in a still pond. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together softly. And I do believe, my dears, that the time has come to discuss the murder that never happened. Miss Marple let the words settle. Observing the household as they exchanged anxious looks, she continued, the truth, I'm afraid, is far less dramatic than we were led to believe. Gerald Hari was never murdered at all. He vanished by choice. Lady Elena gasped, that is impossible. Miss Merrill inclined her head, and yet it is true. You see, Gerald's so-called disappearance was meticulously planned. The staged witness accounts, the misplaced letter, the whispers of debts and affairs, all designed to mislead. She turned her gaze towards Sir Reginald, and I must say, Sir Reginald, you played your role quite convincingly, the concerned uncle, eager to put the matter to rest. Sir Regal's nostrils flared. Are you accusing me of, oh, nothing so crude as murder, Miss Morley said with a polite smile. But you must admit, discouraging further investigation was in your best interest. She then turned to Iris. And you, my dear, must have wondered why your fiancé would withdraw a substantial sum of money mere days before he disappeared. Iris's hands shook. I never questioned it. Gerald always had secrets. Miss Morley nodded. Yes, but this. It was his finest moment, yet he had no intention of coming back. A stunned silence enveloped the room as Miss Marple leaned in, her voice steady and resolute. Gerald had orchestrated his vanishing act with the aid of an accomplice, and the crime at hand was not murder, but fraud. Sir Reginald's expression darkened at the mention of fraud. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with intrigue. Oh yes, my dear, and I believe that if we examine the details more closely, we might uncover who assisted him in his disappearance. A wave of disbelief swept through the gathered crowd. A deception, not a murder. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger before continuing. Continuing, you see, Gerald Hari did not disappear out of fear, nor was he taken by force. He vanished by design. Lady Elena's breath hitched. But why? Why would he do such a thing? Miss Marple's gaze swept across the room. Because, my dear, Gerald was not merely running from troubles. He was orchestrating a crime, one far more calculated than we imagined. Sir Reginald scoffed. Fraud? Preposterous. Miss Marple merely smiled. And yet, the evidence is overwhelming. Gerald withdrew a substantial sum of money from the bank just before the vanishing act unfolded, yet he was not solitary in this endeavor. Her gaze shifted to the photograph discovered in Gerald's study. We had all presumed this woman to be either a lover or an adversary, but those notions were misguided. She set the photograph down on the table, revealing the truth. This woman was his accomplice. A collective gasp filled the room. Gerald and this woman orchestrated a scheme, a rather clever one, if I may add. They meticulously staged his disappearance, sowing just enough confusion to deter a serious police investigation, and ensured that the funds he withdrew would be untraceable. Miss Merrill looked directly at Sir Reginald. What better way to escape both creditors and family obligations than by faking one's own death? Lady Elena's voice trembled, but the letter the witness Miss Merrill nodded. It was planted to mislead. Gerald's letter was designed to look suspicious, but not enough to warrant a real investigation. And the so-called witness who saw his body? Conveniently unreliable. Miss Merrill folded her hands. Gerald and his accomplice were meant to disappear together, and they would have succeeded if not for one small mistake. Miss Merrill reached into her pocket and placed a gold watch on the table. There was nothing extraordinary about it at first glance, but to Miss Merrill, it told a very particular story. The true brilliance of deception, she said lightly, is in the details, and yet it is always the details that give one away. She glanced at Sir Reginald. When I first examined Gerald's room, I found this watch on his bedside table. I imagine it was meant to appear unimportant, just another forgotten belonging. Miss Merrill picked it up, turning it slowly, but the watch had stopped. Sir Reginald frowned. And what of it? Miss Merrill smiled. It had stopped at 10:47, a perfectly ordinary time, unless one considers the timeline of Gerald's disappearance. She placed the watch back on the table. Lady Elena, you insisted Gerald vanished sometime after midnight, but if that were true, why was his watch frozen at 10:47? A murmur of realization swept through the room. Miss Merrill continued, a watch stops when it is dropped or damaged. That means whatever happened to Gerald, or whatever he wished, We are led to think that events transpired prior to 10:47 hours, before he was supposedly last seen. Iris guessed the timeline was a fabrication. Miss Marple nodded, recognizing a meticulously constructed illusion. Gerald likely orchestrated his exit before midnight, knowing everyone would accept the last sighting as truth. She allowed her words to resonate before delivering the final revelation. This watch confirms one undeniable fact: Gerald Hari did not vanish as we were made to think. He departed long before anyone was aware. With that, the entire ruse collapsed. Just Chapter 7. Justice and Reflection. Gerald Harway had always considered himself clever, yet clever individuals often err by underestimating those who observe quietly. It was 2 days following Miss Marple's revelation at Foxglove Manor when the authorities, acting on a tip, discovered Gerald Harway at the docks in Dover. His ticket was purchased under a false name, and he had altered his appearance, his hair neatly cut, a new suit, and a carefully cultivated air of nonchalance. However, fear is a challenging emotion to conceal, as the inspector's voice revealed. He spoke with a calm demeanor as he prepared to leave. "Mr. Hari." Gerald froze. Then, with a slow exhale, he straightened. "I don't know what you mean," he said. The inspector smiled coldly. "Oh, I think you do." Just like that, the game was over. Gerald did not resist as they led him away. Perhaps he understood the futility of it all. Perhaps he realized too late that his meticulously crafted deception had been unraveled by an old lady wielding knitting needles and a keen eye for detail. Meanwhile, at Foxglove Manor, Miss Merrill simply sipped her tea and remarked, "It is always the subtle details that reveal a person's true nature, wouldn't you agree?" Gerald could not have orchestrated this alone. Every crime hinges on two essentials: a plan and an individual daring enough to execute it. As the truth emerged, so too did the identity of the enigmatic woman, not a lover, nor a blackmailer, but a solicitor who had fallen from grace. Her name was Margaret Ellison, a once respected figure now shrouded in disgrace after losing her license for manipulating estate documents. She was the one who had steered Gerald, teaching him the art of siphoning funds and how to disappear without a trace. It was not passion that had intertwined their fates, but rather greed. Miss Merrill had sensed it from the outset. It was never about romance, she reflected. No, my dears, it was about money, deception, and the hubris of those who thought they could evade the consequences. Yet, in the end, they were ensnared, for no matter how meticulously a lie is woven, there is always someone patient enough to unravel the truth. Lady Eleanor sat in her armchair, gazing into the void, the lace handkerchief in her lap forgotten, crumpled in her grasp. "I truly believed," she murmured. Her voice barely above a whisper. She said, "I truly believed my boy was dead." Miss Marple watched her with quiet understanding. "Because you loved him, my dear, and love, when mixed with fear, has a way of clouding the truth." Lady Elena's hands trembled. "It wasn't just love," she admitted. "It was guilt. I thought if he had died, it was because I failed him, because I didn't protect him." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And so, when there was no proof, you filled in the gaps with the story that made the most sense to your heart." Lady Elena let out a shuddering breath. But it was all a deception, wasn't it? He wasn't taken from me. He chose to depart. Miss Merrill hesitated, then gently replied, "Yes." Tears welled in Lady Elena's eyes, but no further words emerged. There was no comfort to offer for a grief that had never truly existed. Only the anguish of realizing it had all been in vain. Sometimes, Miss Merrill pondered, that was the cruelest reality. Her fingers adjusted the delicate shawl over her shoulders. Harriet, the maid, stood nearby, hands clasped in front of her. "Will you be leaving us for good, Miss Merrill?" Smiled. "Oh, my dear, I rather think my work here is done." Harriet nodded, and yet Miss Marple's gaze drifted back toward the house, where the shadows stretched long in the late afternoon light. Yet she murmured, "Not all questions have been answered, have they?" Harriet shifted on her feet. "You think something's still amiss." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Instead, she simply watched the house, as if listening to the ghosts of whispers that had yet to settle. Then, with a knowing smile, she turned to Harriet. "Sometimes, my dear, the greatest mysteries are the ones we weave for ourselves." And with that, she stepped into the carriage, leaving Foxglove Manor behind, though not entirely forgotten.